Welcome to Lecture 5. Today we continue with the unit Emergency Considerations. The previous lesson we looked at direction and control of the emergency management plan, and now we continue. The first consideration or issue that we want to look at today is the issue of communications. So communications are essential to any business or any kind of agency operations. If you have a failure in communications, this can result in a disaster itself, especially if you have some kind of a disruption occurring as a result of a hazard or any kind of unplanned emergency. With this in mind, you need to have contingency planning, or in other words, you need to have some kind of backup plan in place should any disruptions to your operations take place. So everything we talk about today, bear in mind we are talking about it from an organizational perspective. So you want to consider the everyday functions that are performed by your facility, and you'd want to look at what is the role of communication in those functions. For example, you are a student at COSTAT. COSTAT is an organization. Should we have any kind of emergency, if there is a failure or disruption in the communications, all the stakeholders within COSTAT, such as students, staff, everyone can be affected. For example, if we have a flood that makes it impossible for you to get to class, if there is a failure in COSTAT's communication system and communication plan, how would this information be communicated to the students? So you must have a plan that is both short-term and long-term in terms of managing these disruptions. You would also want to establish procedures for restoring communication system as quickly as possible. So if there is a failure or disruption in your communication system, you need to have a clearly thought out step-by-step plan as to how you're going to restore that communication system. So let's talk about emergency communications. So you want to consider the functions of your facility and what it might need in order to perform in any emergency situation, and the communication systems that would be needed in order to support them. For example, you want to consider what parties would need to be communicating with each other. So you need communication between responders and the incident commander within your organization, the incident commander and the emergency operations center. Remember, your incident commander is a part of the emergency operations center, but he's also responsible for the team that is on the ground responding to the incident. The incident commander would also need to communicate with employees. He would need to communicate emergency operations information, such as whether or not there needs to be an evacuation of facilities, etc. The EOC and outside response organizations would need to communicate with each other, because remember, the EOC, all emergency management information passes in and out of the center, and those emergency response teams on the ground, they would need information as to how to proceed. Communication would also be necessary between neighboring businesses, employees' families, customers, the media, etc., and your organization, because all of these different groups are groups that can be affected or will have a role to play in the management of any emergency. Family communications. In any emergency, employees will need to know that their families are okay. Communication between the employees and their families would need to be possible. So provisions need to be in place for that. You need to make plans for communicating with the employees' families in an emergency. So for example, you will have emergency contact information that should be available on every employee's personnel files. So contact information would be available so that information concerning any emergency, either at the facility or in the general community, can be communicated to the family. Communication would also involve a reporting system or notification system. For example, we need to establish procedures for employees to report an emergency. So sometimes you may find an emergency occurring within the boundaries of the facility. Let's say, for example, a fire, a localized fire. The employee is going to need to know what is the procedure to report this incident so that the incident could be addressed. If a procedure is in place, the employees need to be informed of the procedure. They need to be educated about the procedure. Additionally, some other ways of communicating this information would be to post emergency contact information in prominent locations for ease of access. For example, emergency response numbers can be posted nearby so that employees can access this information easily. There also needs to be prepared announcements that can be made over public address systems in times of emergency. So you don't want to now having to be, after the emergency has occurred, now trying to determine what the details of the announcement should be. That should be prepared beforehand. So that should be part of the communications reporting process. Additionally, you would want to have a warning system in place, also part of your communications plan. So a warning system would be needed in order to establish a system for warning personnel that an emergency has occurred on the premises. A warning system should include the following. It should be audible or within view of all people in the facility. It should have an auxiliary or a backup power supply. So if you have a power failure, your warning system will still be functional. And it must have a distinct and recognizable signal. So remember, we just indicated it must be audible or within view. So that means that that distinct or recognizable signal can either be sound, such as a siren, or it can be lighting. You know, sometimes you may see emergency lighting signals, warning signals, a flashing red light, etc. So that was communication. Let us talk about another major issue that needs to be considered when we are talking about emergencies, managing emergencies. You need to consider life safety. So safety in the facility is the first priority during any emergency. And one of the most important means of protecting life may be through the process of evacuation. So as part of your emergency plan, you should consider putting together an evacuation plan. So this evacuation plan, it may involve the entire community, and it may also take place over an extended period of time, such as a few days. This may be as a result of an escalation in the emergency, as it would involve larger geographic extents and larger numbers of people. So you need to be prepared for that when planning for your evacuation. As part of your evacuation plan, you would want to designate routes and exits. So you'd want to designate a primary and secondary evacuation route and exits. So when we talk about routes, we are talking about pathways. What streets should we take? What corridors should we take? Exits would refer to a point out of a building or vehicle or any confined area where the hazard may be. So you'd want to have primary, which would be the first option you would take. Secondary often would be required if there is an escalation or some kind of unexpected event occurring with the emergency. So that would be the secondary evacuation routes and exits would be your backup plan. These routes and exits must be clearly marked and they must be well lit. As a result, you should make sure that you have emergency lighting in place in case that there is a power outage during the evacuation process, because these markings, these lightings will mark the way out of the hazardous area. Here we have an example of two typical types of evacuation maps. The first one we're looking at here is an example of a community evacuation. If you look at the map, you will clearly see that what we're looking at is a coastal area in Japan. This is a tsunami evacuation plan in Japan. And what we have here, this line here represents the tsunami hazard area. So these are the areas that, should there be a tsunami, that they would expect to be affected. As a result, evacuation will have to take place. So what we have is the yellow arrows represent the routes out of the hazardous areas into safer areas, and the green dots represent the destinations, actually, the assembly points, evacuation target points, assembly points, that's what they are. Okay, and then many times you find that even beyond those assembly points, you would have to evacuate further distances, possibly to shelters. So this is a larger scale evacuation map. On a smaller scale, you find you can also have evacuation maps for within a facility or a building. And this, for example, may be an evacuation map that you may see for Kostat. If I'm not mistaken, I think we have some of these posted by the elevators at City Campus. So those of you who are familiar with City Campus, you will see them in prominent locations by the elevators. So these maps, actually, you would have layouts for each floor, and it will give you an idea of the direction along each floor that you would need to go in order to evacuate. And the point at which the map is posted will tell you that this is where you are located. So this is an example of two evacuation maps at two different scales. We have the building evacuation map and the community evacuation map. So still talking about life safety, as I mentioned before, many times as you evacuate, you would have to assemble at a particular point. So these are our assembly areas, and where you have assembly areas, accountability must take place. It must be very important. So obtaining an accurate account of the personnel after a site evacuation requires planning and practice. Hence the reason you find that facilities will go through evacuation drills, fire drills, etc. So these designated assembly areas where personnel should gather after the evacuation. So these are the assembly areas, sometimes known as muster points, assembly points, etc. At this point, after the evacuation, you would take a head count. This is to ensure that every person who was present at the facility can be accounted for, so that if anyone is missing, they would know that there is a likelihood that some kind of search and rescue may have to take place. You would want to establish procedures for further evacuation in case the incident expands. So what happens is, you would probably at this point require secondary assembly areas which may be further away from the point of the designated primary assembly areas. further away from the incident or the hazard. Now the shelter would be the next level of evacuation. At this point, many times the scale of an emergency makes it impossible for persons to return to their homes. In cases such as that, you would be required to take shelter at another facility somewhere safe from the hazard itself. So in some emergencies, the best means of protection is to take shelter either within the facility or away from the facility in a public building. So if this is required away from the facility, you find, for example, many parts of the world would use schools, churches, government buildings, community centers as shelters. Even shelters require planning, so preparation ahead of time is needed. So you will have to establish procedures for sending personnel or sending persons to a shelter. You need to know who gives the command, what resources are required, if transportation is required. All of these things need to be put in place. You need to determine what supplies would be needed. A shelter must be well stocked. Food, water, medical supplies. Additionally, you should have a designated shelter manager. So that is somebody who takes control of the running and the operation of receiving people into the shelter. Because remember, each shelter can literally accommodate a fixed number of people. Beyond that, you can actually have a secondary hazard taking place, because remember, it's not only a matter of food and water and other facilities. When you look at things like your toilet facilities, if you have too many people, you can have a public hazard occurring inside of there if you have too many people for too many days. Additionally, you would have to coordinate plans with authorities and other organizations who may need to be involved in the emergency operations. So this is all part of the planning for the shelter. Training and information is critical to this component of any emergency plan. You must train your employees within your organization. You would need to train them in evacuation. We talked about evacuation drills already. You will need to provide information on shelters, where are the shelters, and any other safety procedures that would be required. So the employees need to be not only trained but information provided. So, and that is a critical thing for you to recognize. There is a difference between training and education. Education involves the impartation of information and knowledge. Training, on the other hand, takes it a step further. Hence the reason we would do drills. And the reason we would do drills is so that with practice, when an emergency does occur, a person would instinctively know what is right to do, what is required to do. Information alone does not permit that. So it's necessary to have training and drills involved as part of the life safety process. So you'd want to conduct sessions at least annually. So that's at least once a year, preferably more than once. You want to provide emergency information as well, such as checklists and evacuation maps, which we've mentioned before. You'd want to make that information available. You'd want to post those evacuation maps at strategic locations. So that is in a location, in a facility where you have a busy thoroughfare, where you know a lot of people will actually come face to face with that evacuation map. You want to consider the needs of the customers and others who visit the facility. So if you have a facility or an organization where you're providing a particular type of service or product and you have people coming in and out all the time, your employees are not the only ones who will need training and information. Hence the reason you find some organizations will have a program in place that every visitor who visits their facility, they are required to go through a visitor orientation where they would be provided life safety information before they are allowed to proceed into the facility. Family preparedness. So you'd want to consider ways to help employees prepare their families for emergency. Now this type of preparation increases personal safety, not only for the family, but also it helps the facility to get back up and running at the soonest possible time. Why is this? For example, if an employee is concerned that his family may not be safe, his productivity is not going to be high. If there has been an incident that is larger scale and an employee's property has been damaged, he is going to be very concerned about what is happening at home and not be able to focus on his job. Hence the reason it is also important not only to prepare your employees but to prepare their families. So information should be directed towards the families of employees, and where possible provide training as well. Then we want to look at property protection, the next issue for consideration. So you'd want to look at ways of protecting your facilities, equipment, and vital records. So records would also be considered important property. And it's essential, and these are essential to restoring the operations of the organization once the emergency has occurred. Because remember, your organization is providing a service in one form or another. So some of the things you would need to look at in order to protect property would be to establish procedures for fighting fires containing material spills, moving equipment to safer locations. These are just a few examples of different hazards that can occur. So you'd want to establish procedures for dealing with the different hazards. You'd want to identify sources of backup such as equipment, parts and supplies for businesses, because when you have any kind of emergency, you will have a disruption in your operations, and many times you find that different bits of assets that belong to the company, whether it's equipment or supplies, may become damaged. So you'd want to identify sources of backup. Where can I get access to these things quickly in order to bring my operations back up and running quickly? You'd want to designate personnel to authorize, supervise, and perform facilities shutdown. Sometimes in an emergency, it is necessary to shut down machinery, computers, etc., so as to minimize the potential for fires and other things occurring during an emergency. You'd want to obtain materials to carry out protection procedures. So protection procedures that may have been mentioned before. For example, if you have to fight fires, you would want to make sure that you have fire extinguishers at your beck and call. You would want to make sure that you have personal protection equipment available to you so that you can be safe when you are dealing with these various hazards. Protection systems. These would be automated systems, but that would provide warning. These determine the needs for systems to detect abnormal situations and provide warning and protection for your property. So some examples might be fire protection systems. Example of fire protection systems would be things like smoke detectors and fire alarms that would alert you to the fact that there is some fire related hazard on the premises. You'd want to have systems in place such as water level monitoring. Some places, especially in industrial settings, they They use water a lot for cooling, etc. This would have been a situation that existed with the video case study, the Fukushima nuclear disaster that you all looked at. And some examples of this would be facilities to monitor the the level of water, where water levels drop too low or they go too high. Signals and warnings would be set off. Additionally, you would want to have automatic shut off of equipment where necessary, so that you can actually hasten the progress of dealing with the emergency. For example, if equipment becomes too hot and there is a risk of explosion or fires, the equipment has been designed to shut off automatically before it gets too hot. You'd want to have emergency power generation available, because many times when power is lost during an emergency, this can exacerbate the effects of the emergency in any setting. Also related to property protection is the issue of mitigation. In other words, what can we do to reduce the effects of emergencies? And some of the ways you may look to do that might be, for example, moving or constructing your facilities away from floodplains. So you may be currently located in a place that is prone to flooding. Maybe you should not have been there in the first place. Is it possible to move to another location? Are you in an earthquake zone? Is it possible for you to move to another location? Additionally, other things you can do is you could look at changing processes or materials that are used to run a business. For example, if you are a manufacturer, there may be certain materials that you use in your manufacturing of a particular product that may be highly flammable, for example. You would want to consider, is there a substitute material that I can use that may be less flammable? So these are the things that you might want to look at. And these are just a few examples. Then you also need to consider facility shutdown. Now this is generally a last resort, but it is always a possibility. Improper or disorganized shutdown can result in confusion, injury, and damage to property. So you'd want to have a very well organized shutdown procedure in place. Some facilities require simple actions, such as simply turning off equipment, locking doors, and activating alarms, while others require more complex shutdown procedures, such as you would have seen in the Fukushima nuclear disaster video case study. Personnel must be trained in shutdown procedures, especially if this is a very complex shutdown procedure. The personnel must be well trained, they must be well educated and informed as to what the procedure would be. When we talk about property protection, we also mention we want to preserve vital records. So records preservation is very important. And this is essential to quick restoration of all your operations. So some examples of vital records would be things like your payroll records, insurance, etc. Some approaches to preserving records will be proper labeling of vital records so that you can retrieve and find those records very quickly. Backup of computer systems, so you want to make sure that all your computerized records, that you have a backup system somewhere where you can make copies of them. You'd want to make copies of all your records. Many organizations like to have both digital and paper copies available to them. Excuse me. Many organizations are actually also taking advantage of technologies to allow them to store data off-site. And in more recent years, we find even the availability of cloud computing that would allow you to store data in the cloud is also available to us. You can also increase the security of your computer facilities. For example, you're talking about simple things like increasing the ability, or rather increasing the security of your facilities by making it more difficult for persons to get in and out of the facility. So you're talking about hazards like cyber security issues, for example, making it difficult for hackers to get into your computer facilities, computer databases through firewall protection, encryption codes, etc. And then we have community outreach. Now, community outreach is critical to the disaster management process. It meant you have to maintain a dialogue with community leaders, first responders, government agencies, community organizations, and the utility companies as well. So, in other words, all the possible stakeholders, you need to be in communication with them so that they can have information as to what your emergency plans look like. They should also have an input. You'd want to have regular meetings to review emergency plans. You want to identify ways in which your facility can help the community in a community-wide emergency. So the community would also want to know that what your civic responsibilities look like. You'd want to maintain community involvement in order to determine how you can assist each other, that is the different stakeholders, in times of emergency. So in times of emergency, there must be cooperation. So it's not only your organization. Depending on the scale of the emergency, all the stakeholders need to be involved in assisting each other in one form or another. Now, local community outreach efforts conducted by the ODPM, that's the Organization of Disaster Preparedness and Management for Trinidad and Tobago. They actually have two programs that takes place at the community level. One is the Community Emergency Response Team, the CERT program. And the CERT program, they go into the various communities and they actually train the villagers in emergency response. So remember, emergency response will actually first be the responsibility of those who are present at the scene. And they can actually make the difference between life and death for some while they are waiting for first responders to arrive. Then another program, Communities Organized and Ready for Emergencies core program, involves training in mitigation. So they go into the communities and train the locals how to different strategies that they can use in their environment in order to minimize the impacts of hazards in their community. Community outreach can also involve the use of mutual aid agreements. Now, we talked about mutual aid agreements before, and so this type of agreement can avoid confusion and conflict in an emergency, because the role of every stakeholder would be clearly established. It can establish mutual aid agreements with local response agencies and businesses as well. So your agreements should define the type of assistance that's being provided. Is it manpower? Is it engineering assistance? Is it finances, etc.? You'd want to identify the chain of command for activation. So anytime you have several groups of people involved in responding to an emergency, you must have a clear chain of command so that you do not have confusion. And you would also want to define your communications procedures, as we have mentioned before. So the mutual aid agreement should address all of these things. Community service. So Community-wide emergencies often require business and industry to assist the community. And these are some of the various ways in which businesses and organizations can assist a community where an emergency is community-wide. They can assist with personnel. For example, they may be able to provide engineers and other skilled persons to provide guidance and assistance in carrying out certain tasks. They can provide equipment that villagers will not have, shelter where there is a need for evacuation to safer grounds. They can provide training in terms of, for example, first aid, mitigation measures, storage, food, clothing, building materials, funding, and transportation. Okay. Community outreach. You must also consider public information. So when the emergency extends beyond the facility, the community will need to know certain things. What information goes out to them? They need to know the nature of the incident. What type of incident is it? What is the scope of the incident, the scale of it? What is the possible danger to them and to anyone else? And they would also want to know what is being done to resolve the situation. So these are critical questions that information going out to the community must answer. Now the media plays a very important role in terms of the involving the community during times of emergency. Media relations in emergency plays the most important link to the public. You must develop and maintain positive relations with media outlets in your area. You would want to determine their needs and interests. So you are more likely to get cooperation from the media if you can identify what interests them. You'd want to be able to explain your plan for protecting personnel and preventing emergencies. The media would be very interested in knowing what you are doing about potential hazards. And in order to communicate this information to the media, you would want to designate a trained spokesperson. Because communication is a very critical thing. Communication can make or break a relationship. So you want to make sure that the person who is speaking on your behalf is trained and also well informed as to the facts. Note, the media is not your friend. They are not there to do your bidding. The media can influence public opinion, so you would want to provide them with factual information. You would want to highlight to them the importance of the work you are doing in the community with regards to preparing for emergencies, and you would want to indicate your awareness of your responsibility to the community. All this information is going to aid you as an organization in the community in getting cooperation from the stakeholders in the community. And finally, you would want to have a recovery and restoration plan. Your recovery plan considerations. Consider making contractual arrangements with vendors for post-emergency services such as records preservation, equipment repair, earth moving, or engineering. Anytime you have an emergency, before you can get your operations back up and running, you would often need to replace supplies, replace equipment. You would need assistance in protecting your records, etc. So you would need to reach out to businesses and contractors that can supply these things. You'd want to identify and determine critical operations and make arrangements for bringing those systems back online. For example, a critical operation for a hospital may be dealing with medical emergencies. So you would not be able to bring everything that happens, every operation that happens at the hospital back online. But you'd want to identify and prioritize the critical operations, place them in order of priority, and you will work on them to bring those back on stream. Continuity management with regards to recovery and restoration. Not every key person will be readily available or physically at the facility at the time of an emergency. So you'd want to make sure you have a backup in place. Who is the next person in command? Who is the second person? You need to make sure that there is always someone available to approve and sign off on issues during times of emergency, so that operations are not held up. So you want to ensure that recovery decisions can be made without undue delay. You would also want to consult laws regarding continuity of management or continuity of your operations. Insurance is also important, that you consider your insurance. During times of disaster or emergency, after the emergency, it's often not possible for persons to have access to the kind of cash or funding that they need in order to restore their facilities and operations. They would need assistance, and assistance can come in the form of insurance. So insurance needs, how should you address your insurance needs? You want to have costs covered that would facilitate required upgrades to mitigate against hazards. So upgrading your facilities to increase the capacity to stand against hazards. You'd want to cover your losses, because you would most likely have incurred some losses as a result of, for example, flooding and fire. You'd want to consider what records and documents your insurance company would want to see. So you'd want to make sure all of that is available and on hand once the emergency has passed and you're ready to go into recovery and restoration. Employee support. Employees who rely on you for support after an emergency are your most valuable asset. Remember, your employees can actually help you restore your facilities quickly and more efficiently once they are comfortable. If they, on the other hand, have to be dealing with their own personal emergencies during times of disaster, then they would be more of a liability to your company's restoration plan than an advantage. So some of the ways you can assist them would be cash advances, salary continuation, allowing them flexible working hours or even reduced working hours, or even the ability to work from home, providing crisis counseling, care packages, daycare, etc. Resuming operations. So immediately after an emergency, you would want to take steps to resume operations. These steps would include establishing a recovery team. So you would need a specific team for this. You'd want to establish priorities of operations to be resumed, as we mentioned previously. You'd want to ensure the safety of personnel on the property. So make sure your personnel are safe. Assess remaining hazards. Remember, this is after the event. Maintain security at this incident at the incident scene. Conduct employee briefings. Make sure your employees are aware of what is happening at all times. You'd want to keep detailed records. Account for all damage related costs. You want to protect undamaged property and conduct salvage operations. So these are some examples of activities that would take place in order to resume operations. Then we also have administration and logistics consideration. So what we would want to do here is maintain complete and accurate records to ensure emergency response and recovery. So records, complete and accurate records are Very important. Some examples of administrative tasks or actions would be prior to the event. You may have you will have an emergency plan, so you'd have to put an emergency plan together. They would be responsible for training records, ensuring that all employees and stakeholders are regularly trained. There would be well written communications. During and after the emergency, tasks would involve maintaining phone logs, detailed records of the event, injuries, and follow-up actions. You will want to be able to account for all personnel, coordinate notification of family members, and issue press releases. So these are some of the administrative functions that would occur. On the logistics end, so logistics refers to the organization and the implementation of the plan. So before an emergency, logistics tasks would include acquiring equipment, stockpiling, designating emergency facilities, establish training facilities and mutual aid agreements, and to prepare for a resource inventory. So these are tasks that would occur before. During the emergency, on the other hand, you would want to make sure that you have maps available for your emergency responders so that they would know where they have to go. Provide material safety data sheets to employees so that if there are chemicals that they are dealing with on the premises, they know what they are dealing with and how to deal with it. Other tasks would involve moving backup equipment into place, repairing parts, arrangement for medical support, food, transportation, shelter, power, etc. And they would also want to provide for backup communication. So these are a lot of things that would be occurring during the emergency. So this concludes our lesson for this week. Please proceed to the activity for this week. Thank you.